Behind the Built Environment, the podcast from BESA, the UK's leading trade body for the building engineering services sector.
This is Behind the Built Environment, and I'm David Frise. Today I'm joined by Mark Farmer, founder of CAST Consultancy, author of the landmark Modernise or Die report, a former champion for modern methods of construction, and now a leading voice on the Construction Leadership Council's People and Skills agenda. Mark has spent years warning that construction's traditional labour model is running out of road. Today we'll ask whether the industry really has a skills problem or a deeper capacity problem, and whether our approaches, competence and regulation is still too thin to deliver safer, greener, more productive buildings. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, David.
We always start with some quick-fire questions, yes, no only. That sets the kind of agenda of what we're going to discuss. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Great. Has construction genuinely modernised since Modernise or Die?
No.
Does construction talk too much about skills and not enough about productivity?
Yes.
Is regulation moving faster than industry capability?
Yes.
Is the industry still too reliant on cheap, flexible labour?
Yes.
Are clients part of the problem?
Yes.
Hope that doesn't cause you a problem.
I had to think about some of those answers, but I've stuck to the rules.
That's why we never give them to you before. And it's always more difficult than you think, because you really have to think about it. And most of them are a bit grey around the edges, but thanks for the clear, concise answers. So let's start with some of the main body. Since Modernise or Die, has anything really changed? Or what has changed, do you think?
It's been 10 years since I wrote that report, and I think it's fair to say a lot has happened in the interim. A lot's happened within the industry, but a lot's happened in terms of external events that have probably shaped the course of that journey. I think it's fair to say in some of it has been some modernising, but there's been a lot of dying as well. If you think about the corporate failures we've had and some of the businesses that haven't stayed the test of time. So I think, we've got a mixed bag, and I think in reality that was always going to be the case. It wasn't a binary scenario where suddenly the industry as at large was going to flip to a different way of doing things. It was always really about individual businesses and their decisions as to what that meant for their health and welfare, corporate health and welfare going forward. It's clear that one of the biggest defining influences, if you like, as to where the industry is now has actually been the economic backdrop. If I were to sort of look back since 2016, there was actually a lot of good work that was happening in the period between 2016 and probably 2022 when industry started to respond to that broader challenge, probably helped by the fact that it was a broadly positive economic backdrop. And I'm conscious that I'm talking about the COVID period during that. A lot of people say, what are you talking about? And actually looking back, COVID was a short-term interruption for the industry, but it actually there was a lot of business still done. And if anything, there was a boom that came out of the back of the pandemic. What really started to sort of impact the trajectory of the industry was probably the economic downturn from 2022, where I think the industry has been affected. It has been affected around its output and its capacity to think differently, including about modernisation, I think has been pretty significantly impaired. Ultimately, where we are now, and certainly the journey to where we are now, is characterised by an industry that seems to have gone back to some of its survivalist tendencies. It's pretty much day to day. It's doing things the way that we've always done them. But again, other events have led to us having a very different industry. So we've obviously had the whole Grenfell story play out during that time that's led to the Building Safety Act. So we have a different regulatory backdrop. So there's lots of sort of drivers acting in different directions, but it feels it is a different industry. I would say it is a net positive, but we're nowhere near where we need to be, and certainly what I was setting out in 2016.
Is it just too fragmented an industry to get a cohesive response to that, to modernisation?
Yeah, I think, there's clearly, when we talk about the industry, it's not a thing. It's not an entity. It's an agglomeration of tens of thousands of businesses, including many micro businesses. So when you talk about industry change, you're talking about something that's actually about, lots of individual component parts. It's an atomized industry in many respects. So to understand how you change an industry at large, you have to understand the structure and the shape of the industry. So driving change in such a fragmented industry was always going to be very, very difficult. You might argue impossible. So one of the things you need to understand is, well, how do you have the biggest impact for the amount of effort you put in? What are the levers and that you can push and pull around trying to drive as much change as possible across a proportionate representation of the industry? And clearly the biggest challenge is getting that driven down to the SME, lowest levels of the SME supply chain, who, they are technically part of the industry, but often they will be in their own channel, doing their own thing day to day, and don't feel any connection with the bigger sector picture. So fragmentation is clearly a big challenge that the industry will continue to face in the future.
So would consolidation on a greater scale be good for the industry in terms of its ability to modernise?
It would, on paper. The issue I see is that the basic structure of the industry has evolved over many, many years, and it's not accidental. It's evolved in relation to what is clearly a very difficult trading environment, cyclicality. So I've already talked about the downturn that's happened in the last 4 or 5 years. That is a recurring feature of our industry. We trade in a boom and bust environment. Capital spending in construction is discretionary for many people, so it goes up and down, particularly in the housing market, but even in commercial construction. So the shape of the industry has evolved to reflect that, which the biggest byproduct of that is subcontracting and subcontracting and so on and so forth, and devolving responsibility for holding payroll, holding fixed costs. The idea of being a fleet of foot business with minimum standing costs or fixed costs, and maximising your ability to tap into a variable cost base, including an itinerant workforce, is one of the big features of our industry now. So the idea of consolidation sort of cuts across that, and it feels theoretical. It feels a distant sort of position from where we are now. It doesn't mean that some of the way that the industry is organised at the higher levels around the hierarchy of contracting, etc., it doesn't mean that you wouldn't necessarily see consolidation in that space, but that's not the engine room of the industry. The engine room of the industry remains below, which is the doing part of our industry, and the trades and the operatives who physically work on the sites. The contracting, consulting parts of the industry are very much around direction and management and setting the direction for what everyone on site is doing. So I see 2 different challenges there. One, which is further atomisation potentially and further fragmentation, and one that might be consolidation around cost reduction and efficiencies.
Yeah. But I guess when you're a really small business, it eats up a lot of time and resource. Just completing PQ processes, for example, doesn't leave much room for innovation or thinking about how you modernise your business when you are either chasing payment, winning work, keeping your workforce employed, finding materials. All of those things are kind of counterintuitive to a modernising industry, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think that's the scenario you set out there is the reality for many businesses on the ground. And going back to this dichotomy between what is potentially capable of happening in the upper echelons of the industry, where you do have a bit more bandwidth, you have a bit more time to think. In some instances, it's people's day job to think about that around innovation and change and process efficiency. But in your typical small business, there's very little bandwidth for thinking about that. It is about chasing the next job or chasing payment, and it's about managing the day-to-day. So, being able to recognise that an innovation strategy for the industry at large has to cater for both ends of the spectrum is a really important reality check in all of this. It makes it really difficult in reality. And, and it's something that I talked about in Modernise or Die. It's something that I continue to talk about around how do we try and instill change at the lowest ends of the supply chain in a way that's practical, is inclusive, respects the challenges that everyone has particularly in the current economic environment. I come back to that again, that it's even more difficult when times are tough. When times are better, actually even the SMEs could get their head around a different way of thinking, maybe a bit more adventurous. Certainly when it comes to skills and training, might have a different appetite for doing things. But if the work's not there, we live in a demand-led industry where decisions around investment in skills, training, modernisation, innovation are completely correlated to how much work you've got.
I think we'll come on to this later, but skills training in particular for someone who's, say, a mechanical contractor requires different thinking. And different thinking is really difficult. And therefore you don't devote time to it because by the time you've got your head around it, you're chasing something else. But let's talk about, because I rarely go to a meeting nowadays where somebody doesn't mention we've got a skills shortage. And I think you argue that it's not a skills shortage, it's a capacity issue. Could you define what you mean by that?
Yeah, so there's probably a couple of things that come out of that. So I do challenge that sort of, I think it's quite lazy thinking around just saying we've got a skills shortage. And I think it is, it's self-perpetuated to an extent around what you see in the media and what people say. I think it's a lot more nuanced around the reality of what we have. So firstly, the first point I'd make, a lot of people say we have a skills crisis that is characterized by an attraction problem for young kids coming into our industry. I challenge that because I don't sense we have a shortage of kids that want to come into our industry. We have, if anything, an absorption issue in our industry. We're not able to absorb the young talent that is wanting to come into our industry. We're not able to take on the number of people in post-16 construction and engineering service related courses are not finding their way into the industry. There's a problem between people that have decided that's what they want to train and learn about post-16 and their eventual ability to find paid employment in the industry. So there's an absorption issue rather than an attraction issue. On the capacity point, so I talk about the 3 C's around the skills debate. I talk about capability, competency, and capacity. They all mean slightly different things, but they're all related. So capability is the potential for you to perform a role or a piece of work on paper. Competency is your proven ability to do that piece of work to a proven standard. And capacity is how much of that you're able to do in total. And what it drives is those 3 C's around capacity, capability, and competency are all interrelated. And it brings in the fact that it's not just a headcount issue, it's actually a quality issue of the existing standing workforce and what they're trained in, i.e. the competency. So to convert capability into competency, you have to go on a journey of ensuring the quality of your workforce is at the right standard. And the quality and the quantity is what drives the capacity. So all too often, everyone resorts to it being a headcount related debate. We haven't got enough people. I think it's myopic to various parts of the equation which relate to what have we already got and how competent are they, which for me, there's a direct correlation between competency and capacity, which is driven through productivity. The more competent you are, the more likely you are to be more productive. And that applies to everyone from a designer to an installer operative on site. So we need to have a more broad debate about workforce improvement, which is not just about we need to press gang a load of people into our industry, which, as I've said, is not the debate. We have plenty of people in the pipeline. It's actually more about what they're being trained in and what are we adding to and what are we influencing around the quality of the standing workforce that already exists, around their ability to do the job properly without rework, without defects, without going back and wasting time, which all affects productivity.
This may be an urban myth. I don't think it is, but you mentioned COVID, and during that period, you got a bit of a boom, but productivity, I think, increased because there was a requirement to do more planning before you started work.
Yep.
And as an industry, we're a bit hurry-scurry, aren't we? We haven't probably designed it. We haven't probably thought it through, but get on site and get people busy because nothing, it looks better than having people on site being busy. But that's really unproductive. Is that part of the culture that needs to change? Payment release, for example, only starts when you're on site, or all of those elements that just feed into this, or the actions that feed into a culture.
Yeah, I think the COVID experience that you quoted there is really instructive. I think when the rules of engagement got published by CLC in terms of social distancing and all of the restrictions that we adhere to, it absolutely drove a culture around pre-planning, logistics, and ensuring that the reduced available workforce that you had were put to best use. So what that did is actually at a individual or gang level, it improved productivity. As you said, all the stats that I heard and speaking to lots of people at that time and since have indicated that per worker and per gang, per team productivity improved through that pre-planning. The issue is that ultimately, if the reduction in workers is such that the improved productivity does not offset the overall quantum of work done, there is an overall capacity challenge. Coming back to this interconnection around, well, what's the price being paid for having less workers? But the issue is, if you have more workers, then what's the disproportionate downside benefit of having to do more and more rework and having a legacy downstream of stuff that you need to go back and put right, maybe 12 months, maybe 24 months, maybe longer in the future? I think there's a really interesting debate about sometimes less is more, but there's an equation there. There's an optimization position that you probably have to think about in terms of what's the optimal workforce for any given operation on site. My view, I do a lot of work in residential construction, and it's quite clear to me that labour intensity on site, particularly around fit out, so that's mechanical and electrical services, that's finishes and interiors, joinery, etc. When you have the most people crowded on site, crawling on top of each other, is where productivity falls off and where rework risk increases to the max. A lot of the claims that you see in terms of defects, etc., correlate with that.
So in theory, the Building Safety Act with the gateways should improve that, shouldn't it? Because it forces people to plan properly, program properly, think about, design properly before you start that hurry-scurry activity.
The theory behind how you achieve certainly Gateway 2 compliance, so the idea of being able to pre-plan your design to a greater degree of detail than perhaps you would have done ordinarily prior to the Building Safety Act requirements, is a great opportunity to bring in the supply chain to think about not just how you're designing it, but how you're going to build it. And it's that challenge that we've historically faced in the industry, in that things have been designed in a vacuum. The interface between the design and the construction is procurement, which is a commercially led function. That means that what happens in that design bubble doesn't always work in the construction bubble on the other side of the commercial interface. And I think Gateway 2 and the Building Safety Act has challenged that, I think, in a good way. I think it enables, if you're going to have a Gateway 2 successful submission, it promotes the idea of much more integrated thinking with your supply chain, including the people that are actually going to do the work. I think my experience on the ground today is that it's a bit of a mixed picture, though. It's not always playing out like that. I think there's certain elements where the commercial and the transactional imperative is still there, which I think potentially doesn't maximize the opportunity that Gateway 2 provides as a means to driving more integrated design and construction. And collaboration, which is a term that's often overused in our industry, ultimately is that but is seen in some quarters as there's a cost to collaboration, which is more expensive construction. And I think it's fair to say, and I'm talking as a quantity surveyor by training, I spent a lot of my career involved in the commercial aspects of the industry, that there is some justification for being really skeptical sometimes around the idea of collaboration, because I think the industry has to prove the benefit of collaboration in a tangible way to clients and their advisors in some respects. Around collaboration should be a means of how we're going to drive to a better solution, how we're going to drive the waste out of our process. Our whole process of design and construction is just laden with waste at every turn and part of the process. And that should drive cheaper construction. So why is it that collaboration is seen as more expensive? And I think there's a really interesting sort of thing that we've got to get to the bottom. There's a challenge there we've got to get to the bottom of as to what good collaboration actually drives as a bottom line benefit. Lots of people think it's an easier process, it's a less adversarial process, but actually it comes with a price. It shouldn't be like that. If we're doing good collaboration, we should be producing quicker buildings, cheaper buildings, higher quality buildings.
Without contractor input at an early stage, don't you end up with a building that the client A can't afford and B is unbuildable?
Yeah, and I think that comes back to the point around how you drive good collaboration. So if you take what a contractor's role is in the current landscape, they're orchestrating a process on site that is delivered by subcontractors. So what you want to have, successful collaboration, successful integrated design, procurement, construction workflows, is everyone playing to their strengths. So actually collaborative processes should involve all the main players around the table early. So it's not just a tier one, it's the main designing and installing subcontractors. It is the client and the design team, obviously, and you should be going through an iterative loop of how you evolve a design that has had the feedback from all of those players. The issue is that historically, when that's happened, the procurement mechanisms come back into play, and there's been a round of better buying the job. Let's see if we can get a better price from someone. And all of a sudden, the people that input to that process are not the ones who end up building it. And we've got to be, if we're going to have a successful collaboration, it absolutely has to be the people that were around that table that own the outcome. And, that then plays to a whole different debate about multi-party contracting, alliance forms of procurement, a whole load of more philosophical points around what are the contract forms and forms of procurement that promote different behaviours, which I have to say, by and large, have not been adopted in our industry.
Oh, we're talking about trust, aren't we?
Yeah, fundamentally, it's about trust. It is about trust, but it's trust based on delivery. It's not trust as a nice, comfy, cuddly word that's put out there like collaboration. So let's all sign a charter and say we're going to be nice to each other. It's trust based on proven outcomes. And my experience, when that's happened, then you get more work out of it, because the client, if they see the end benefit, will repeat procure. And it just becomes embedded. If trust is used as in the wrong context around, well, trust us, we'll do a good job, and actually you end up with the same job, then that's not a good advertisement for trust. And I think there's a lot of damage being done by all quarters in industry. This is not a blame game. This is all about understanding the behaviours that drive our industry, which in many instances are commercially driven at the end of the day. That means that attempts to try and modernise the method by which we procure, the method by which we organise our project teams, have been effectively ambushed by those long-standing commercial imperatives that sit behind, just below the surface.
Wouldn't it be fair to say the opposition to the Fair Payment Bill that's going through at the moment is based around this to a degree, and particularly the abolition of cash retentions? How will we deliver a defect-free building unless we hold money? Is that lack of trust? And actually the answer is procure better. Procure from companies that you can trust to do work. As a contractor for many years, it took years to build a reputation. It takes no time to destroy it, so you never walk away from a project. So I've never quite understood that. Surely if you procure well, you won't have a problem.
Yeah, and I think that, again, is part of the tangible outcome. I think the whole thing, the retentions debate's an interesting one, because it's all born out of the fact that everyone's expecting a job to have defects.
Yeah.
So one's assuming that you're not going to get it right first time. It's just, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the fact that there's issues going to get found in the defects period and beyond, that you have to hold money back. And that's been the commercial model that's evolved out of that. So now we're moving to a regulated position. There's the big debate about, well, what are the sureties and all of the other financial instruments that you can put in place to offset that risk. We're much better having a discussion about, well, let's have a better level of assurance that doesn't need, or if it does, it can be insured. Assurance and insurance are two linked principles, that the more you can assure an outcome, the more insurable that is. So if you need a surety bond or you need some kind of financial instrument, it's linked to the capability and the competency of a business and of the individuals in that business to perform to an outcome. And I think, at the moment, we have an industry that is sort of hardwired to what's happened in the past, and even you could argue presently. And to get people thinking differently, that the risk of failure has reduced, and that you can reduce that failure actively through the procurement mechanism, as you've just said, seems to be a bit of a blind spot. I think the way that businesses prove and assure their outcomes needs to be better presented. I think, the idea of being able to have evidence, hardwired evidence, proven empirical evidence of your defects history, your ability to put work right or not, or have compliant work in the first place, is part of the whole culture we need to move to, where evidence actually drives decisions from clients and their advisors on who to go to in the supply chain. And it puts the pressure back on procurement, because procurement becoming a lowest price wins activity is clearly at the heart of some of what we end up picking the pieces up from. But coming back to the point I previously said, it shouldn't just be about if you're a better contractor, you're a more expensive contractor. There is a difference between making money in the supply chain and actually avoiding waste. So actually you can be a cheaper contractor by having less waste and doing work for right first time and still make the profit that you need to make. And I think that's the intelligent debate we should be having. We should be delivering cheaper projects for clients, but everyone in the supply chain should be making more money. And the whole focus of the industry should be, how do we do that? It should be cutting out the waste, cutting out transactional waste, cutting out the physical waste, integrating design and construction so what we design is buildable, so it's more productive. All those debates need to be brought to the fore and done in a way that evidences an outcome. Comes back, I keep coming back to the point that when you prove it, and not just with like a report with a load of fluffy words, proven metrics, then there's not many clients out there, commercial or public, that would say, well, why wouldn't I do that? At the moment, we have a proven data gap, I would suggest.
We do. And we actually ran a project in Actuate UK to try and get people to give us evidence of their defects. So to run that very metric for the very reason. And we couldn't get it to fly because people would not give us their data, even though it was anonymized through a third party. And the industry kind of has a toxic relationship with information requests. Yeah. The first question you ask yourself is, how will this be used against me? Yeah. Rather than how would this make the industry better?
Yeah, and I think we are in this, unfortunately, we're stuck in a loop in that regard. I've come across it as well in the whole productivity debate. So I've done work with the Construction Productivity Task Force where we're trying to, in the early days of that, we were just trying to get some data so that we could share what do we think productivity levels really are. Because, even that question, people can't give you a definitive answer as to what the industry productivity is at a macro industry level, at a sector level, at a project level. There's all sorts of different ways of measuring it. And it is down to this aversion to sharing data. Even in an anonymized scenario, I think there's just a general nervousness that it's going to be used against someone. Yeah, and actually some of what it says at the moment and historically is probably not good reading.
No, probably not. You've suggested that construction operates a very thin layer of regulatory compliance. What did you mean by that?
So I suppose I was alluding to the fact that our industry, for lots of reasons we've already discussed actually in this conversation, around the sort of pressures of doing the day job and running businesses, etc., and the way that we've structured ourselves and etc., is very much in a, how would I say this, in a box ticking mentality. So the idea of you have to do something is seen as an obstacle. It's seen as that's an obstacle we've got to clear, and then we get on and we do it. As opposed to what's the right thing to do? How do we improve ourselves? How do we address productivity and waste reduction? How do we make sure that we're going to get it right first time so that we can prove that we're a safer bet and we can win more work? Everyone's in, right, let's just get over that hurdle, and then we can get on to doing the work that we've always been doing. And I fear that the way the Building Safety Act is currently configured, and a lot of it's still to play for, so I'm not suggesting this is a done deal, feels as though it's just a version of that. So there's a lot of the procurement rules. So if you take social value as an example of an area of procurement that has been seen as a good thing to do, it's all about driving much broader value in construction to society and to the economy. A lot of the way in which procurement has evolved in that part of the agenda has been box ticking. It's been, prove you can do all of that, but give us your cheapest price. And I just feel there is a danger if we're not linking the regulatory environment to proven outcomes and to, more importantly, rewiring the culture and the behaviour of the industry. You're going to get, that's what this thin compliance level layer for me looks like. It's like a superficial sprinkling of, we've done that. But if you dig deep beneath the surface around the people involved in the process, have they actually changed their way of thinking? Are they more competent? Is probably the biggest thing that we need to track as an outcome. How do we prove competency? How do we record it? And how do we link competency to the better outcomes? The safer buildings, less defects, quicker delivery, cheaper buildings, all the hard variables that the industries really could be measured by. Having a gateway to, for instance, the way where we are in the industry at the moment, having a gateway to sign off does not mean you're going to have a safer building as it stands at the moment until it's delivered through Gateway 3, proven that what you've designed is what you've built, and that it being done in a way that isn't just, thousands of photographs. There's something more that sits beneath the surface, which is actually changing the whole way in which things are done. The surveillance of that process, I think, is going to come into big question. I think technology is probably the biggest game changer in town when it comes to that at the moment, around how we're going to track the journey from 2 to 3 and prove that the building has been delivered in the way that we thought it was going to be, and that everyone's done what they should have done, because ultimately that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to orchestrate thousands of people, hundreds certainly, potentially on most jobs, that are responsible for creating a system. It's the systemic nature of our industry which is the real challenge. You get individual competency, you get collective corporate competency, but they're all working in a system that doesn't always allow you to be competent. So my fear is that it's quite a complicated answer to that question, but I just fear that what you're going to get is a veneer of, we're safer now. We've got compliant buildings in inverted commas, but have we actually averted another Grenfell? That there's a lot things need to change beyond the Building Safety Act, in my opinion.
Is the way the industry set up leading to a danger that the Building Safety Act will lead us to well-sealed, fire-protected buildings that are probably not ventilated properly, for example, so that we stop the fire risk, but we create a health issue 10, 15 years down the road when we've value engineered, say, the ventilation?
I think there's a big debate, and it's played out quite recently when we've had some hot weather, around this trade-off between building performance, so from a fire safety perspective, from an environmental perspective around the push towards passive house and other standards, and what that means around building quality, air quality in particular, ventilation, overheating risk. They're not necessarily things that are mutually exclusive. You can have a high-performing building and have it well ventilated, but there's some practical aspects around what's common sense in some respects that probably needs to be thought about. And I just think there is definitely an element of unintended consequences that sometimes a push in a certain direction creates a downstream problem in another direction.
Yeah, the industry is very well set up to deal with project by project and problem by problem. Aren't we looking at a series of integrate or disparate problems that all need to be solved by some process, some other process, for example?
You would argue that's building control, that's building regulations, that's the approved documents. And, there's obviously lots of different imperatives that are currently sitting on the industry to be resolved. And then they obviously need institutional direction, which is from MHCLG and building regulation evolution. And we've seen a lot of that. Clearly, we've just had the Future Home Standard being released. You've got the whole Building Safety Act overlay on fire and structure, etc. But they should all be coordinated. The idea of coordinated approved documents and a holistic reform of building regulations is really where we need to be. It can't be piecemeal. Let's take that approved document and look at it in isolation. It has to be joined up so that we're able to avoid some of these unintended features of what happens.
In BESA, we define the market into thirds. There's 1/3 of companies who get regulatory change, cultural change, competence requirements, and compliance requirements. They get it completely. They become competent, compliant, get ahead. There's a middle third who go, I've no reason why I'm understanding why I'm being asked to do this, but I want to work in this industry. I want to continue. Therefore, I will do it. And there's 1/3 who go, well, there's a regulation for this. We're not going to do it. How do we drive that 1/3 either into the middle so they become compliant or out of the industry altogether? Because at the moment, just final point there, because at the moment, if the companies in this area or these 2/3 lose work to this 1/3.
I think what you've characterised there is, you can argue about the proportions, but that tiering of, your mindset and outlook in some respects is absolutely right. I see it every day. I think the drivers for change, particularly for the lowest part of the industry, the lowest tier that you said that is like fairly nonchalant, or it's not connected into the whole agenda of change, doesn't understand why it has to do it. A harsh reality is the only way that you'll bring them to the party is either through some form of requirement, regulation or other requirement to have to meet a minimum standard or to get over a bar, or you exclude them from the industry. And, the latter is obviously, that's quite a dramatic thing to think about, particularly at a time when we keep talking about capacity crisis and we need people, albeit caveated by what I said earlier around sometimes it's better to have less people of a high quality than just headcount. But my view is that we need to have a very much more controlled environment at that bottom end of the industry, so that there's a lot of emotive discussions. I'm personally a big advocate of moving towards digital competency passporting for the whole industry, and that everyone assumes that is that a CSCS card. No, it's way beyond that. We're talking about evidencing your personal competency in a dynamic way, so that actually it's not just at a point in time based on a qualification. It's an ongoing requirement to prove you're competent to do a particular piece of work, and that actually you don't get onto a construction site, unless you have that card and that proven competency. So that's beyond organisational competency, that's personal competency. If you think of that at the lower end of the supply chain, it's actually becoming, it's the whole thing about license to practice. It's about creating a barrier to entry. Lots of what is good about our industry is that our industry is inclusive. It enables people to get to come into our industry and have a great career. But we can't do that at any cost. We have to have a responsibility for people coming to our industry that have responsibility for what they do. Particularly, it's a no-brainer when it comes to safety critical operations, but actually it should be the case across everything. If you're a painter and decorator or general tradesman working in the domestic sector, you should have standards. And I think that's where we've got a difficulty at the moment, because that whole part of the sector tarnishes the greater sector. The cowboy builder is sort of aura is pervasive, and we need to find a way of addressing that. And it's going to be tough, and it could be really a motive around creating a barrier that a lot of people will push back on. Even the more recent changes around the CSCS card, the removal of grandfather rights and the industry accreditation system, that caused enough of a hoo-ha. So you can imagine what moving towards proven minimum competency requirements across the whole industry would look like. But that's probably what we're going to have to do if we're serious about addressing that. The other point I would make on that is the role of procurement in levelling the playing field. So you rightly said that some businesses who are not engaged in anything around responsible behaviour, investing in skills and training, modernising their approaches, win work at the expense of those that do. So there's clearly a role of procurement. Coming back to the procurement discussion we had, well, what are the mechanisms by which procurement can level that playing field? How can responsible clients drive that from a commissioning client perspective? How can tier one contractors then mirror that? How can house builders who are procuring clients drive that into their ways of building, so that they don't just select based on the lowest price? And as I say, if we can do that by ensuring that the businesses we're talking about can do good stuff and actually are not prohibitively expensive as well, then everyone's a winner. So at the moment, I think there's a sort of a correlation between the amount you invest and your cost to the employer. I think our challenge as an industry is getting to a point where it's not a cost. Actually, what you're doing is we're training people, and the cost of that is being recovered through the fact we don't have defects, we're more productive, and actually, it equalises out. But I'm aware that the reality is often that's seen as being a premium price, because people are investing in stuff that they're not actually able to reflect back in a cheaper tender price.
You're back to your point about a thin layer of compliance. We've for a long time had a technical audit within the BESA membership requirement. The PQ processes typically have 400 questions, but not one that says, can you actually do the job? And that's the bit we introduce, and we've removed members who cannot meet that requirement. But that comes at a premium for our members to achieve that. And now we're bringing it into the supply chain to ensure that it's throughout. Isn't that something that clients should be recognising and going, well, actually, I discharge my duty of care here in the selection of a services engineer?
Yeah, and I think, again, you what you're touching on there is that there's an emotional disconnect between clients of the industry, particularly those that what I would call occasional clients of the industry, those that engage with construction as a sort of means to an end for their core business. So developers, for instance, will very much dip in and out of the industry based on the health of the development market. And, that's, as we know, is cyclical. So commitment from clients is pretty much driven by their sort of sense that they have a responsibility to think differently about how they procure. This whole thing about lowest price wins, unfortunately, in a market like we're in at the moment, most clients are not going to have the ability to pay more. I think it's for advisors and consultants to give their clients the right advice around what the right price is for a job and what the characteristics of the businesses that are going to absolutely do the right thing. And as you say, inherently discharge legal duties, because some of this will relate back to, certainly under the Building Safety Act, around things that are going to be seen as being the responsibilities of the client, legal responsibilities of the client to discharge their duty holder obligations. And a lot of it, you'll then get into a grey area as to, in non-regulated work, as to what's the right price for just better assuring your outcome. As I say, I'll keep coming back to it, but for me, if we can get to a world where a more assured outcome is actually the same price or cheaper, because actually it means you've got less waste and more productive outcomes that are quicker, that are reflected in the price, it becomes self-fulfilling. We're not there at the moment in the industry. We've got this two-track industry where doing it on the cheap literally means a cheaper price for the client that becomes tempting. So what we need is doing it right is cheaper.
And it builds a better industry. And then the image looks after itself because you be a reputation of delivering on time, on budget, quality.
Yeah, and it self-fulfills. And, what you get in coming back to the retention debate is that people will then say, well, we don't need retention on this supply chain because they've proven themselves to be pretty much right first time. Or if we do need some kind of surety, then it's minimal. It can be insured because it's an assured outcome. And assurance of outcome is going to become increasingly the buzzword, if you like, particularly as technology, AI, some of the things that are starting to feature in our industry enable better assurance potentially of what a complex system-led process is. So I think we need to aspire to a situation where doing it better is cheaper. At the moment, I think the assumption is it's like comfortably expensive. So because you're actually paying for more, when in reality you're paying for a better process that's actually a cheaper process and it assures the outcome. And I think that mindset change feels quite distant at the moment, how we get to that point. But it needs a lot of rewiring of the industry processes to get to that point as well, because businesses can be better, but they're made more expensive by other things outside their control.
Sure.
So you need a closed loop ecosystem to experiment with a whole different way of doing things so you can prove that case that better is cheaper.
And that seems like a good point to finish on, except I've got one final question. And that is, you're king of the industry for a day. Well, some would argue you already are, but king of the industry for a day. What one thing would you change that would make a big difference, do you think?
So, yeah, look, I come back to the backdrop within which the industry operates. If I had a superpower, if you like, it would be to influence government to use our industry much more intelligently as a tool of economic growth. And by that, I mean smooth our pipeline, give certainty on our pipeline. The biggest destructive feature that we're seeing at the moment is variable pipeline, short-term thinking, the ability to just know that we're going to have a certain amount of workload on a more constant basis. It doesn't have to be booms, but we don't want busts. So we want more certainty. There's a role for government in creating the economic backdrop, how it uses its public pipeline, how it uses policy in a more general way to just give the industry the breaks it needs to think about confidence to invest in people and processes, come rain or shine.
Mark Farmer from CAST Consultancy, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
That was our latest episode of Behind the Built Environment. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, review, share it with colleagues, share it around, and come back next time for the BESA podcast. I'm David Frise. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Behind the Built Environment podcast from BESA. If you like what you heard today, then please follow and rate us on your favourite podcast app. Come and join us over on LinkedIn, BESA Group, and carry on the conversation. And if you want to find out more about joining the BESA community, then please visit thebesa.com to start your journey with us today.